The longest election campaign in modern Canadian history has begun. Good evening, I'm Kenneth Burke.
And I'm Wayne Booth.
And tonight, my colleague and I will be analyzing the rhetoric and power that was displayed in the various candidates' speeches about the economy during the Maclean's National Leaders Debate.
The excitement, the drama, the identification. We'll be getting into all of that later tonight, but first, let's start with an analysis with a brief introduction of the topics of Canada's economy.
If there's one subject on every voter's mind as this election approaches, it's the economy.
We have dangerous economic winds blowing in Canada.
The country's economic health is shaky. We're probably coming out of a mild recession. Oil prices have slumped. Exports are weak. How high should taxes be? What's Ottawa's proper role in the economy? Is Canada's wealth fairly distributed? That's the context for our discussion of economic choices.
Good evening. My name is Paul Wells. I'm the political editor of Maclean's magazine. Tonight, I have with me Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, and New Democratic leader Tom Leclerc. My first question tonight is for Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, your economic plan is built around a middle-class tax break. Is that really enough of a response given the challenges that you say Canada faces right now?
Paul asks an excellent opening question, right away directing all discussion to the core of Mr. Trudeau's economic plan. Since it is a tag question with its implicit insistence on a yes-no answer, is a way for Paul to control the direction that the beginning of this debate takes, since it is the most controlling type of question.
Yes, but this also allows Trudeau to give a detailed response regarding his economic platform.
True. Let us see how he answered.
For 10 years, we've seen the approach that Mr. Harper has taken has simply not worked for Canadians. By giving opportunities and tax breaks to the wealthiest Canadians, he has missed opportunities for growth, making a decade of surpluses and turning it into 8 consecutive deficits. The Liberal Party, on the other hand, has put forward a plan to invest in the middle class, to support the middle class, to create growth through strengthening the middle class. And we're the only party up on this stage tonight that's committed to lowering taxes for the middle class and by asking the wealthiest to pay more tax. Because when you put money in the pockets of the middle class Canadians, the economy grows. Mr. Harper is ignoring the fact that our country is in a recession and wages are shrinking. We need a fresh approach, one that understands the way to create growth in the Canadian economy is to strengthen the middle class, to make sure that people have jobs, confidence, and the capacity to spend and be sure about the future they are building. Mr. Harper, you say that you're interested in the future of the economy, but isn't it true that after 10 years of your leadership, Canada is no better off economically?
Quick, everyone drink. Trudeau just said middle class.
And of course, by that you mean the term middle class seems to be a key definition for Trudeau.
Well, yes, but also...
Well, let's stay on topic, shall we? So Mr. Trudeau starts off with some fabulous rhetoric, if I do say so myself.
Arguably, one of the greatest rhetorical achievements has to do with how he controls the definitions of the terms wealthiest and middle class. As my good friend Jasinski always says, the person who is able to control the power of definition has a crucial linguistic resource at his or her disposal. Justin Trudeau has used the term middle class, one which most Canadians self-identify with, to champion himself as the leader of tomorrow, and also to create... Justin Trudeau has used the term middle class, one with which most Canadians self-identify, to champion himself as the leader of tomorrow, and also to create the perspective through which we and others will look at the economy. Once the stage has been set, it is easier for him to propose taxing the wealthiest.
Precisely. You know, the identification that Justin Trudeau uses is fascinating because I think that he realizes that every movement that we would recruit its followers for among many divergent bands may have some spot towards which all roads lead. In this case, of course, he puts forward the Liberals' plan to aid the middle class as the solution. But what he does before this is to describe Stephen Harper as one who has unsuccessfully supported the wealthiest instead of the middle-class Canadians. And when Trudeau does this, it is because he realizes that men who can unite on nothing else can unite on the basis of the foes shared by all.
So do you think he uses the term wealthiest as a negative term then?
I wouldn't say negative. However, Trudeau uses it as a type of formal pattern in order to help the audience with its identification of him and Harper. According to this form, Trudeau is for the middle class while Harper is for the wealthiest. And a yielding to the form prepares for assent to the matter identified with it. Or, in other words, people associate Harper with supporting for the wealthiest and themselves with the middle class. They will be more likely to agree with and support Trudeau.
Which brings us to Trudeau's closing question for Harper.
Yes. It's not a bad question, actually. It gives Trudeau's rhetoric some extra power as he's facing his opponents.
Well, he can hardly expect that Mr. Harper will provide the kind of answer that the question presupposes when Justin Trudeau suggests that the Canadian economy isn't any better than it was 10 years ago. However, he forces Harper to begin his speech with a look at his own past economic record.
The ability to manage the topic under discussion is a powerful rhetorical tool, no doubt. Let's see how Stephen Harper responds. Over my tenure as Prime Minister, we have seen an unprecedented economic stability. However, Canada has kept economic growth strong, with increased job development and stronger income growth in middle class in comparison with any major developed economy. Let me just correct a few facts. The Bank of Canada said over 80% of our economy is growing. Our exports, non-energy exports, are up 10% this year. To maintain this growth, we must stick with a plan that works by lowering taxes for businesses rather than blindly risking our fiscal security on Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Montclair's plans of high taxation, high debt, and high deficits, which is failing everywhere else. Mr. Harper, the vocabulary that you use to describe your opponent's plans is sometimes quite grave. You've compared Canada under the Liberals or the NDP to Greece. You've called the tax increase to Rachel McNulty as introduced in Alberta a disaster. Will a few changes in tax rate at the margin actually have that kind of catastrophic effect? The reason I address these situations so plainly is because the Canadian people need to understand the fallacy and the dangers of considering an economic strategy that is dependent on higher taxation and gross government deficits. Other parties are proposing that Canadians spend tens of billions of dollars on additional spending to be financed by permanently higher tax rates and permanent deficits. And as we can all clearly see, following this strategy will directly lead Canada into economic stagnation or even a recession. Let me give you the facts, Mr. Montclair, from Statistics Canada. 90% of 1.3 million net new jobs are created are full-time. 80% of them are in the private sector, 2/3 of them are in the high-wage industries. That's why incomes have been growing in this country. Let me give you the facts, Mr. Montclair, from Statistics Canada. 90% of the 1.3 million net new jobs are full-time. 80% of them are in the private sector. 2/3 of them are in high-wage industries. That's why economies have been growing in this country when they haven't been growing in other countries. And I'll tell you what won't grow our economy. The kind of plans that these guys are presenting, where they want to increase CPP taxes. A hit of $1,000 for every worker making $60,000 a year, and another $1,000 on the employers if he wants to keep them on the payroll. These are not the ways you handle economic turbulence of oil low prices. If anything, this is irresponsible leadership that will drive our economy into a recession.
First of all, it should be pointed out that the Prime Minister has an excellent cross-examination technique. he calls into question not only the specific facts Trudeau claims to know, but also sources the claimed knowledge. Through this reference to figures released by the Bank of Canada and Statistics Canada in terms of rhetoric, Mr. Harper is using clarification terms such as "let's be clear" to put forward his own argument and to call into question Mr. Trudeau's.
He's also mastered Orwell's technique for speaking. Mr. Harper refrains from using a metaphor, simile, or other figures of speech in his address and gives the details of his economic plan in a way that is succinct and direct. However, I cannot help but feel that something is missing.
I'm glad you brought that up, Booth, because I was just about to point out that there's a startling lack of identification in the Prime Minister's speech.
Identification, of course.
Mr. Harper does not truly identify himself with his audience. Other than using generalities as Canadians, I cannot see any attempts by him to identify directly with the audience.
But he sounds so convincing. Especially that part about high taxation and high deficits have failed everywhere else in the world.
That's a strong suit of Mr. Harper, his tonality. When the Prime Minister speaks, it seems like you are meeting a new person, and the first sentence he utters is some controversial subject that is spoken with such tonalities as though he were speaking in conclusion. I remember talking to my old friend Bentham about this, and he said, originally, all words for were neutral, but by degrees they acquired, some of them an eulogistic, some dyslogistic cast. An interesting use of the words to denounce Mr. Harper's opponent's credibility.
Is it just me, or does this all seem quite manipulative? Maybe it's even bad rhetoric.
It's because the political party leaders are talking about the economy. Currency is the driving force for all citizens in Canada's infrastructure. Although Mr. Trudeau's and Mr. Harper haven't said it directly, they're all talking about money.
It can't just be all about money. Both the Prime Minister and Justin Trudeau are talking about helping Canadians through improving Canada's economy.
And how are they planning to do that? Pension plans for seniors, tax cuts for the middle class, and more resources directing to improving the workplace standards for the working class. See, all of these elements have dollar value. Though in a money economy, we can expect such purely dialectical processes to be institutionalized in terms of monetary organization, the mystical process of transcendence is traditionally stated in monetary terms, and the dialectic is underlying. It has nothing to do with money.
I see. All right, well, now let's see what Mr. Montclair has to say.
Irresponsible leadership, Mr. Harper, is something Canada has experienced for the past 10 years. Canadians work hard to make ends meet and to take care of their families. That's how I was raised. During Mr. Harper's tenure as Prime Minister, we've actually lost jobs, and this can't continue. However, we have a plan to invest in the middle class and to create new jobs through investment in infrastructure, tax breaks to small and medium-sized businesses, and through creating $1 million $15 a day childcare spots. Because that's not just good for families, that's good for the economy as well. During Mr. Harper's tenure, we've gone through a period of unprecedented economic stagnation. In fact, Stephen Harper is the only Prime Minister in Canadian history who, when asked about the recession during his mandate, gets to say, which one? Mr. Harper, we want to spend our time concentrating on creating jobs for Canadians. What we're seeing here tonight is that you're going to do everything you can to hang on to your job. I'm going to do everything I can to create jobs for average working class Canadians. Mr. Harper, we want to spend our time concentrating on creating jobs for Canadians. What we're seeing here tonight is that you're going to do everything you can to hold on to your job. I'm going to do everything I can to create jobs for average working class Canadians. Well, Booth, how about that Tom Mulcair? Someone's been reading my book.
I think you're right, Burke. But what I'm most impressed with is that insult he crafted. As my good friend Conley always says, it's difficult not to participate the inventive genius and artistic calculation that masters of insult bringing to their task. When he grills Harper about being the only prime minister in Canada who has had 2 recessions during his mandate, it's pretty clear that he's expressing a severely negative opinion of Harper in order to subvert his positive self-regard and esteem.
Well, I suppose you're right. What I thought was impressively done was that jab at the end of his speech about Harper hanging on to his own job, while Tom works to create jobs for average working class Canadians. What a spectacular use of insult and identification.
Identification, here we go.
The insult was pretty good, well crafted and all that.
Wait for it.
But that use of identification, fabulous, wonderful.
We've got a time limit, Burke.
I know, but this is beautiful. Of course, Mulcair starts his speech on the economy with an identification with families, working Canadians, and the middle class, using the idea of jobs as the principle that they share in common, the identification that does not deny their distinctness. But he takes it so much further by bringing it to the sense of division at the end. What did he say again? Here it is. Mulcair says that Harper is going to do everything he can to hold on to his job as Prime Minister, while he himself is going to do everything he can to create jobs for average working class Canadians. Amazing piece of division. You know, I always say that identification is affirmed with earnestness precisely because there is division.
You do always say that. You also always follow the quote by saying, identification is division.
Quite right. And here is a perfect example. Mulcair is choosing to identify himself with a selfless creating of jobs for Canadians, but also identifying Harper with the opposite idea, that of selfishly guarding his own job at the expense of growth for others. He draws on identification of interests to establish rapport between himself and the audience, while at the same time wielding the identification like a weapon against his opponent, using the division to highlight how different they are and how Mulcair is a better alternative to Harper when it comes to promoting economic growth.
You have an interesting point about identification, in that you can persuade a man only insofar as you can talk his language by speech, gesture, tonality, idea identifying your ways with his. How do you think Mulcair's use of the terms average working class Canadians that he closed his speech with, how do you think that they affected the power of the NDP's rhetoric?
Well, without a doubt, the phrase average working class Canadians is an idea that is a summing up of many motivational strands. It reduces a whole complexity of ideas to one apparently simple term, and that is something that makes it easy for the audience to understand. However, it's a complex term for the audience as well, in that it sums up their material conditions in its name. Therefore, the terminology that Mulcair uses doesn't just refer to an idea, but also to an economic reality, that of a class that must work, that needs jobs.
And how does this help his rhetoric?
Well, it helps the rhetoric of the NDP in that these terms contribute to the ideology of what Canadians are like. The ideology he uses is a purposely manipulated overemphasis or underemphasis in the discussion of controversial political and social issues. In this case, Mulcair is using his words to overemphasize the material condition of many Canadians by calling them working class. This then makes his rhetoric concerning job creation much more powerful, especially because it isn't immediately apparent, but it is hidden by the simplicity of the terms that he chooses to describe Canadians.
So true. In fact, what we've seen tonight is that in the use of rhetoric to attack rhetoric, there has been much talk of unmasking as rival ideologies are said to compete by unmasking one another. Each of these politicians has tried to use rhetoric to show the audience their platform and how it can benefit Canada, while at the same time demonstrating with rhetoric their opponent's reasoning is flawed. We have seen contingent realities made by rhetoric, such as deliberative attempts to make the future forensic attempts to change what we see as truth in the past, and epidectic attempts to reshape views of the present. Whose rhetoric will win Canada's votes in the polls? Only time will tell.
This concludes the first debate of this campaign. I'd like to thank each leader for the leap of faith that they've shown when they agreed to participate in this debate. Good luck on the campaign trail to all of you. On behalf of Maclean's, City, and Omni, I'd like to thank the viewers at home and online for tuning in tonight. Be sure to visit Maclean's website for the complete coverage of this campaign.
That's it for us tonight, folks. On behalf of Catherine, Lynne, and Keegan, I want to say how glad we are that you tuned in to see our comprehensive analysis of the rhetoric in the Maclean's National Leaders Debate.
Be sure to tune in next time for a dramatized reading of A Rhetoric of Motives. It's just what your holidays have been missing. I'm Wayne Booth, and on behalf of my colleague, Kenneth Burke, and I, thank you and good night.